got something kind of different, something I've been wanting to do for ages, and it just so happens that AMD is launching these new Ryzen APUs. The one we've got here is the Ryzen 5600G. It's a 6-core, 12-threaded APU. And what I decided to do is I wanted to do a no GPU gaming PC build. So that's exactly what we did today. Let's get into it. As usual with these type of builds on the channel, we use parts that we have here on hand, and AMD actually sent over one of these new Ryzen APUs for us to review and do some testing on. So what we're gonna do in this video is we're actually gonna build the PC. I'm gonna show you some benchmarks, but we've got a really detailed version of all the benchmarks with Windows versus Linux happening over on KernelControl tomorrow. I don't think we've really built that many systems without some discrete graphics, so this is something interesting. I love these type of systems because, you know, they're not really designed to be the fastest gaming systems, however they do play games. But anyway, Claire, do you know what time it is?
Build time.
All right, it's build time. Let's get into it. Okay, here's, let's call it a mid-build palette cleanser. This has never happened to me before. I've been building PCs with TG side panels forever, basically. Did that. I took the side panel off in the clip that you just saw in the video, and I placed it gently on the floor and it exploded. I've never done this before, and luckily, this panel still has the plastic on it. So if you're wondering where the side panel is later on in the B-roll and later on in the video, that's what happened to it. I think you need to get me a garbage bag now, Claire, because this is about to break in my hand. I can hear it cracking in my hand. Oh no.
Okay.
It looks really cool though, but yeah. Don't do what Nick did. I'm kind of embarrassed because this has never happened to me before.
These things happen.
Yeah. Oh. All right, ladies and gents, I hope you enjoyed seeing that come together. It was pretty funny that I accidentally smashed the TG panel, right, Claire?
Oh, hilarious.
This video is a day of firsts, Claire. I've never smashed a TG panel. I don't think we've really built that many APU builds on the channel. What other firsts? I spilled hummus on my t-shirt before while we were having lunch. That's a first, right? first, right? Yeah, never done that before. I'm the most clean eater ever, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
First time having hummus.
Yep. All right, before we talk about all the parts, because there isn't very much, let's take a look at some benchmarks, because I think you might find this quite interesting. Before we begin, I just want to mention that these benchmarks are done just on this system here. We have a full video coming to KernelControl where we compare this to the 11600K and a bunch of other older AMD APUs as well, so you can get an idea of the gaming performance of this compared to those. But for this video particularly, we're not going to be covering that here. So if we just run through these results, at 720p medium, we're getting 101 frames per second. That's at 100% render scaling. And we're getting 63 frames per second with 720p high at 100% render scaling. At 1080p medium, with the render scaling set to 80%, which I think is optimal for Fortnite, you're getting around 76 frames per second. Now that right there is very, very playable. And then if we look at things like 1440p medium with 65% render scaling, you're still getting 57 frames per second. So I feel like there is a lot to be said for this APU in Fortnite, and it is actually quite a good use case for a chip like this. Another benchmark we don't typically run is CSGO. Now at 720p high, we saw 145 frames per second. I personally was quite impressed with that. Very, very playable. At 1080p high, we saw 83 frames per second, which is not too bad as well. Very, very playable again. 1440p high, we saw 57 frames per second. Although it's not hitting that full 60 on average, it is actually still, again, quite playable. And at 4K, we saw it fluctuate between 18 to 21 frames per second. Yeah, a little bit cinematic. Typically when we test our APUs, we use our regular suite of benchmarks, but we use different settings in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, Unigine Superposition, and Basemark GPU. For Shadow of the Tomb Raider, we use 720p low, 720p medium, and 1080p low. And as you can see in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, it's not too bad, but yeah, at 720p low, I would say it's playable. At 1080p low, probably not so much. Unigine Superposition is kind of echoing what we saw with Shadow of the Tomb Raider here, and the results are about average. Now, just to give you a bit of an indication, it's about 2 to 3 times faster than the 11600K's integrated Intel graphics, which we will be covering again in that KernelControl video at a later stage. Last up with Basemark GPU and the Vulkan API. Now don't be fooled by these numbers. Just because it's 275 frames per second doesn't necessarily mean it's good at 720p medium. That's just what the benchmark spits out. And 1080p medium, again, that is a high number, but not necessarily indicating great performance. I will say, compared to all of the other APUs and CPUs with integrated graphics that we've tested for these series of videos, the 5600G is the fastest that we currently have. As you saw from those benchmarks, obviously I couldn't do any thermal testing because I don't have a side panel for this case anymore. I'm not quite sure what we're going to do with this case after this build because it's kind of useless now. Maybe we can turn it into like a plant holder, or we can throw it off the bridge or fill it with concrete, use it as a boat anchor. We can't even fill it with concrete to make it a boat anchor unless we lay it down and then fill it and then like make sure that, yeah, okay, that's too scientific. The CPU is the AMD Ryzen 5 5600G. It's a new APU that launches, I think, now, or maybe the review embargo is now. I don't know. It's one of the two. And it features 6 cores, 12 threads. It's Zen 3. Really interesting performance though for an APU. Absolutely wipes the floor with Intel's integrated graphics. We've covered all of that over on KernelControl. You can see that video tomorrow. The motherboard is the Asus ROG Strix B550A Gaming. This board actually supported me using this CPU without updating the BIOS, not out of the box, just from the last time I used it. It is running the latest BIOS that does support the latest GSUB version for this CPU, or this APU rather, and yeah, it runs quite well. All of the testing that you have seen so far was actually run on our test bench system for this, so not this specific system. However, the RAM timings and everything in this system have been tuned to be exactly the same as the other system, so you can get an indication of the performance there. Speaking of RAM, it's a set of V-Color RAM. It's 4133 megahertz, but I ran it at 4000 megahertz, and it's a Gear Seekers version of the RAM because it says Gear Seekers on it. Anytime any product says Gear Seekers on it, it's the Gear Seekers edition. I don't care what anyone says. Yeah, you put my name on it, I'm gonna use it. That's just science. Science. Put my name on it. I'm gonna give it a red hot crack. And that's basically all of the parts, like 3 things that make up this system to work. But there is a couple other things as well. I used some white Cooler Master cable extensions for the 24-pin power connector and the EPS connector at the top. Now, this whole idea of this PC was to be as cheap as possible and to not really make it cost so much money, because you guys can base a build on this. And interestingly enough, this case now isn't too expensive. I use the 2 stock fans that come with the case. I move it to the front of the case. I put some Deep Cool CF120 Plus ARGBs at the top and the back, just to add a little bit of color, and nothing else really to make it customized. Now, the reason for this again is I wanted this PC to kind of be as budgety as possible. Obviously, there's gonna be some kind of discussion in the description of how much this system would actually cost you. I don't know at this point while I'm filming the video. I just picked some parts that were fairly well priced based on what I know about this hardware at this point in time. The other idea I had with building a PC like this is if you're looking to build something like this now, just to get yourself up and running and gaming, you can game at 720p and 1080 low in quite a few titles. And this would kind of just get you into that PC gaming market. And you can add a GPU later if you want some discrete graphics, if you want to turn it up a notch, because the CPU performance here is very, very interesting. And we're going to be covering that all over on KernelControl. So make sure you subscribe to our second channel, KernelControl, where we do Linux-based benchmarking, but we are covering Windows stuff over there too. I just feel like it's more interesting to put it over there, and we'll delay it by a day just to, you know, do it a little bit differently. All right, I'm gonna put a PC part picker list down below in the description. And if you like some of the music you heard here, I make all the music on the channel, all of it. So without further ado, I'm your boy Nick with Gear Seekers. You peek, we seek. Let's get into some cinematic mode. It's gonna be a short one though. Thanks for watching.